All right, welcome everybody. Good morning and kia ora to the Australian and New Zealand members for the Environmental Health Australia and New Zealand Institute of Environmental Health, or EHANZ, webinar for World Toilet Day. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the original custodians of the various lands on which we are meeting today and their continued connection to the land, sea and community, and we pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders both past and present. My name is Melissa Byrne and I'm the National President of Environmental Health Australia, and I'd also like to welcome the New Zealand Institute of Environmental Health's National President, Tanya Morrison, who is co-hosting this webinar with me today. Tanya, it's lovely to see you again for our last webinar series of the year. And World Toilet Day is observed today, which is the 19th of November each year, to raise awareness about the global sanitation crisis and to inspire action to ensure access to safe and clean toilets for everybody. It was established by the World Toilet Organization in 2001 and was officially recognised by the United Nations in 2013. And the day aims to address the fact that 3.5 billion people worldwide still lack access to safely managed sanitation, and around 419 million people practice open defecation. And the theme for this year is Sanitation in a Changing World, which is emphasising the need for resilient sanitation systems that can withstand climate change and other global challenges. The presentations between our countries will highlight the importance of toilets in protecting health, dignity and the environment, as well as to showcase sustainable sanitation solutions. Today we have two speakers who will be sharing their knowledge and experience and how they've implemented sanitation projects in our ever-changing world. And if you have questions for our speakers, just simply type them into the comment section and you're welcome to comment at any time, and the questions will be answered at the end of the speaker's presentation. So our first speaker today is the Australian environmental health legend, Mr. Bob Handby AO, a Life Fellow of EHA. Bob has over 27 years experience as an environmental health officer in local government with councils and also with the International Committee of the Red Cross, providing safe water and sanitation in major humanitarian crises across Uganda, Iraq, Rwanda, Kosovo, Sri Lanka and the Asia Pacific. He later managed the water and sanitation for international emergencies at the Australian Red Cross and also led the Ebola response efforts in Sierra Leone. As an honorary life member of the Australian Red Cross, and as I've already mentioned, he's a Life Fellow of VHA, Bob received a very well-deserved Order of Australia medal in 2018 and has authored a book, You Will Go, Won't You, in 2021, which documented his 30 years of international aid. And today Bob will be talking to us about toilets, a place to sit, a place to squat, and much more. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's really nice to be here on such an auspicious occasion as World Toilet Day. Because it is World Toilet Day, I propose to talk primarily about my international experience in toilets and latrines and the like, rather than worrying about what happens in Australia, which we all know about. And when I was asked about this presentation and to give it a title, I gave it a bit of a thought and came up with this title, Toilets, a Place to Sit, a Place to Squat, and much more. And it's the much more, I guess, that I'm going to concentrate on a little bit, because I'm going to speak about some of the lessons that I have learned over my journey in providing sanitation in various environments, and some of those lessons that I've learned I'll pass on today, just to help people realise that there's more to toilets than pressing a button, as we have the privilege of doing here in Australia. So if we go to the next slide, the first slide, and that I have put there, and I guess this was my first experience back in 1984, a long time ago now, but it's still very vivid in my mind that the first place I was taken to, and this was the civil war in Uganda in 1984, confronted with people living in this particular camp. And there were around about 10,000 people living here. And I've actually been since then to camps very similar to this, with up to 250,000 people, which is quite mind-boggling as to what the public health problems are. But we're concentrating here today on toilets. And when I was first taken to this particular camp, there were actually no toilets available whatsoever. And so the people, when they had to defecate, would defecate behind their particular grass hut, which happened to be the front door of the people living behind them. There was also a lack of water supply. So people who had bare feet were walking through all this mess, didn't have an ability to clean themselves, etc. So one of our priorities, and I'm not going to talk about the other priorities about fire and etc. I'm going to talk about sanitation. So if we go to the next slide, it'll show that the simple project that we did here was to build simple latrines, which in this case were holes in the ground in appropriately located positions throughout the camp. And when I say we contracted or employed local people to dig the hole, and we would provide them with all the material needed to make it safe and give it a bit of privacy, etc. But one of the lessons, in fact, the first lesson I learned here was having put numerous of these latrines throughout the camp and going back and visiting on a regular basis. It was quite apparent that some people were using the latrines and a lot of people were not using the latrines. And so making inquiries as to why people were using them and some not, it became apparent that the people in this camp came from two different cultures, really. And some of the people in the camp in Uganda come from the north, and they were really nomadic herdsmen who were never in the same place twice. They never had the need to build a latrine. They would defecate wherever they happened to be. And the other people from sort of the south were gardeners, and they lived in the same spot. They lived in a house and they had a garden. So they did have latrines and they got used to using them. But the people from the north had never stood over a latrine. In fact, were quite scared, particularly the children. So we had to undertake a real education program around the safe use of latrines and why you're now living in this camp, you have to use a latrine. So that was a lesson to me that not only do you have to build latrines, talk to the local people about how they're going to be accepted, the design of them as well, but the acceptance about the importance of using them. So when I talk about lessons learned, that was my first lesson, which I've carried through, obviously, the next 30 years of my experience in working in this field. So if we go to the next slide, and it's a very different scenario. And this was a toilet, the ARC stands for Australia Red Cross, and beautifully constructed toilets that we built on some of the islands off Banda Aceh after the Boxing Day tsunami. The Simalu Island got smashed by both the earthquake and by the tsunami itself. So we constructed these really nice toilet blocks with and because of the water table, septic tanks were built. And I was lucky enough to go back and have a look at these after about 5 or 6 years to do an evaluation of the impact of them. And when we build these, in fact, one of the lessons I did learn was we used to do things in threes. We did water supply, we did sanitation, being latrines, and we did hygiene promotion. And that's what we did in this particular area. So I went back and did an evaluation of these projects. And speaking to the people who had these now, and particularly the ladies, the thing that stood out in my memory, and this is quite a few years ago now, but still very prevalent in my memory, was the ladies, when we talked about latrine, the fact that they had a latrine or a Scott toilet in their backyard was fantastic. But I remember one particular lady, she talked about two things. But one was dignity. She said, we now have a toilet, so I'm now happy to invite people to come and visit us because if they need to go to the toilet, I can direct them to our toilet and not be embarrassed to say you have to go to the bush. So when I talk about toilet, somewhere to sit, somewhere to squat, and a whole lot more, the whole lot more being these things around dignity of having a toilet, not only the public health benefits. And the other thing that these people were highlighting to me, particularly the women, was the safety and the security. It was always dangerous to have to go into the bush and defecate. Not only danger in some countries from animals, etc., but just from human beings. So these people were provided with a dignified option to go to the toilet and a safe option to go to the toilet. If we look at the next slide, it's they're a very simple construction inside, and they are what we call squat latrines, pour flush latrines. So this is inside that toilet. You squat, have an S strap under that, and a water holding device there with a ladle, and you just flush the water out of that and flush the toilet. Unfortunately, one of the mistakes that were made here was the people that were sent to do these were not trained in building in installing septic tanks, and they sent and sometimes there were medical people doing them, but certainly not trained. In fact, in my report I said we should have sent plumbers to do this work, not doctors and not nurses, and we had to do And one of the problems that I identified in this in this survey that I was doing was that many, in fact, virtually all the septic tanks were not functioning properly because they had their tanks too far away from the toilets. And when you just pour a little bit of water into this hole and you flush out the solids out of the S-trap, you didn't put enough water to flush them all the way to the septic tank, which sometimes might have been 30 or 40 metres away. So they're all blocked, and which created a massive problem, which we're able to make some changes by building some inspection openings and educate them about putting more water down them. So here we have beautiful latrines, but not necessarily working very well. If you look at the next slide, you see the implication of this was that the flooding of these block toilets around I think the next slide might show some of these pictures of where this is what the outcome was. We turned in that should have been a nice clean environment turned into a quite a dangerous environment. In fact, worse than if they were going to the bush. So the lesson for me here was, yes, they were great. The people appreciated them, but we sent the wrong profession along to do them. And as environmental health officer, I spent many years in local government designing and supervising installation of septic tanks, and luckily enough, I had enough knowledge to be able to rectify and go back here and fix all these mistakes that were made. So if we go to the next slide, sort of highlights this story a bit more, and that is the guy standing there is standing over some toilets that he's building. This is in Bandarche, and he's actually a policeman from Australia, and I was met him at a meeting, and he was introduced to me, and he said, "Oh, Bob, I'm doing all these toilets. Would you come and have a look for me and see how I'm going and making sure I'm doing a good job with the septic tanks, etc." So I was very happy to go out and give him a bit of advice. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that here he and I are looking at a septic tank, and he's asking me the question, is the septic tank big enough? And I'm trying to be nice and diplomatic about it. I said, well, it didn't matter how big the tank would be, nothing will ever get into it. And he was asking me why. Well, if you see that building in the background and tree with a building in the background, the toilet he was actually building from the previous slide was on the other side of that building. So he was expecting, with people standing over a squat toilet with an S-trap with a little ladling, a little bit of water in it, for that to flush all the way to these septic tanks. And clearly the solids lodge in the pipes and over a period of time get blocked like the previous experience. And I'm saying to him, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to redesign the whole system, which fortunately did, and that was by relocating the septic tanks all the way back to where the toilets were. But at least in this case, this policeman thinking is doing a great job, and in a lot of ways was smart enough to involve something like myself that we could rectify this before the mistake was made. So these are lessons you'll learn about installing toilets. So the next slide, I think, shows you some of the diversity, and this was in the Solomon Islands, a place called the Malaita Island, where I was doing a project on putting in rainwater tanks so that people would have rainwater, have drinking water. And some of these islands are only 70 metres by 30 metres, 70 metres long, 30 metres wide, with maybe 50 or 60 people. And the only place they could defecate was out over the ocean, which people say, well, that's terrible, you're crapping straight in the ocean. But in reality, in Australia, that was happening all around the coast of Australia up until 30 years ago. And when the tides came and went, it cleared it out very quickly. So we were designing these toilets out over the ocean. And you say, well, why do we have the bridge to get it there? Well, they're actually extending the size of their islands all the time to cater for the increased population. So it was a bit like town planning. So eventually the island would reach out to where the toilet was. So you really have to have a very open mind and flexibility about the design and the structure of toilets to meet the needs of the population. So if we quickly have a look at the next one. So sometimes in a disaster where people are actually moving because of a conflict or other reasons, we were building them like this so we could actually just pick them up and shift them. A portable toilet, mobile toilet, so all we had to do here was dig another hole and shift it, or if the hole actually filled up, over a period of time. We just pick the whole thing up and shift it, dig another hole, shift the location. So I guess what I'm trying to highlight here is the flexibility around when you're working, in particularly in conflict or disaster zones, about how you go about being effective. If we have a look at the next slide, we get back to what we do in Australia, and this is just a simple composting toilet, which we see all around our national parks, etc., and they're very effective. In fact, when I came back, one of the things I did, other than write a book, I wrote quite a document on septic tanks and poor flush latrines to document all the lessons that I have learnt. And my wife got quite shirty sometimes when I say, "Hang on, stop! I want to go and take a photo of this toilet." But so much was my interest in toilets that I wrote quite a significant article on it. If we go to the next slide, I think it's getting back to what we have in Australia. I mean, I want to say somewhere to sit, somewhere to squat, a whole lot more. There's a whole lot more to toilets rather than just somewhere to sit and somewhere to squat. And I guess having 30 years in the field, I've learned a lot of lessons, and was one of the reasons I wanted to write a book and document all these things for people to learn these lessons and not have to start all over again. In fact, Chris Bath wrote the foreword to my book, and I think in the foreword she described me as Bob Handby, the James Bond of sanitation. So my reputation goes before me. So I think that in relation to World Toilet Day, I'm conscious of the time. That's pretty much what I had to say, and I'm happy to answer some questions at the end of the session. But thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Bob. That was a great presentation. It's certainly shown how sanitation in a changing world and all the different systems that have been used across the globe and all the global challenges that you face with conflict and natural disasters and cultural considerations. So thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge and experiences to our environmental health community. I'll just ask that if anyone has any questions, you can pop them in the chat, and Bob's happy to answer questions. I have a question while we're just waiting for anyone to put them in the chat, Bob. From your many decades of experience, what toilet project has been the most satisfying that you've achieved, that you've completed?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question. Difficult to answer. I think, generally speaking, it has highlighted to me, particularly the plight of women, and I'll diverge a little bit, and probably one of the simplest but most satisfying. When I worked up in northern Iraq during the Gulf War, 1991, I was travelling up there, and we had there was 2 guys and 3 women in the team, and the biggest problem the ladies had, one doctor and 2 nurses, was how they were going to go to the toilet, where they were going to go to the toilet when we were camped up in the mountains. Not a tree to be seen, just rocks. And so when we got up there, I was conscious of the lady. In fact, when we used to travel up in convoy, the ladies would go to the back of the convoy, the men would go to the front of the convoy. You couldn't even go off the road because of landmines. But when we got up there and we set up a tent, I got my Swiss Army knife out in a couple of plastic boxes, and turned them upside down with a serrated part of my Swiss Army knife, cut a nice round hole in the top, put a bucket underneath and a lid on top, and used some box of medical material to give it a bit of privacy. And I went and saw the ladies who were, I could hear their discussions about toilets all the way up. And while we got there, and I went to the lady and said, "Oh, your toilet's ready, ladies." And they just thought I was joking. Took them into the tent and showed them they had a sit-down toilet that I undertook the role of emptying every day, digging a hole and emptying every day. So in the short term, that was probably the most satisfying because it had such an impact. But generally speaking, I think it's all these projects because of the benefit for women more so than men, which is always a highlight.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Another question is, how receptive were people to your advice? From our work, we often find that there is a want for Western-style toilets that may not be appropriate. So how have you managed that?
Yeah, look, it's really, I highlight or try to highlight pretty much through my documentation about stuff is the importance of working with the local population and doing things in conjunction with them. And you're absolutely wasting your time unless you sit down and talk to them about what's appropriate for them and include them in the process, and not only the design, but the location and the structure. I mean, for example, in Fiji, done a lot of work over the years, and in many of the Fiji cultures, some of the islands, you've got to build a toilet for men and a toilet for women. They can't use each other's toilets. So without having that conversation, you'd go and build a toilet here and a toilet there, and one of either the males or the females would be missing out. So, and I've seen a project in Fiji. I've taken photos of it when I've been back over there, where someone's gone into a school and built a compost toilet, and to this day, it's probably 15 years ago, that compost toilet had never ever been used by anyone because they didn't consult the local people and talk to them about the use of a compost toilet. So utilising the knowledge of local people is absolutely vital in all the work we do, to be honest, and more so in sanitation.
There's another question, two parts to the question. It seems like the second part may have been answered, which was, is educating the people more challenging than building the toilets, which sounds like it may be. But what project has been the most challenging project for you?
Probably that environment up in northern Iraq where we were in the mountains and it was just rocks. There was there was very little soil. It was very hard to dig holes. It was heavily mined, and the culture of the Kurdish people was that they after they defecate they wash themselves. They don't use paper. So to try and build latrines of any description up there that were going to be safe and usable, but just the physical aspect of trying to dig into rock and have adequate water supply close enough to them was a really difficult place to build toilets. The people were really keen to build them, but it was just really and we had lack of equipment and material, not like we could take a whole lot of stuff up into the mountain. So that was probably having said before, we built one for our own use. But for the millions of Kurdish people who had fled to the hills, it was a big problem for them.
Yep. And the last question that we have is, do you think biodegradable bags might help in emergency situations to contain and manage the waste and nutrients and leave the water just for hand washing?
Yeah, look, I haven't had a lot of experience with them, but certainly in some camps in Africa, we have used all types of disposable bags, etc., etc. And I think probably the biggest challenge there has been the usage, getting people to use them in the first place, and proper disposal of them. So I don't discount anything in the construction or disposal of waste, but some more challenging than other. In fact, I had an experience in Iraq where we had a stream and the people were defecating in the stream. And when I talked to them about not having their latrines over the streams, they said, well, this is the way we do it. We straddle the stream, we do our business, and we wash ourselves. And then we had to pipe the water down alongside the stream so they had clean water in a pipe and dirty water in the stream. So you can always come up with a solution. But I'll reiterate again, the solution is usually driven by the local population. And sometimes you have to guide a little bit more than you'd like to. Say, well, we can't do this, this, and this for all these logistical reasons, but we can do this, this, and this. So this is the best solution under the circumstances. And we also step things. Sometimes this is a real emergency situation, and then while we're using that, less than desirable disposal system, then we might be introducing a more reliable, more desirable system. So often it is a step process.
Thanks, Bob. That is great advice. And there was one last question that's come through in, do you think with the ever-evolving gender complexities, will this impact the assignment of gender-specific toilets? Have you experienced much of that in the countries that you were in? Or was
look, very, very much so. And it's more so in some countries than others. I mean, some countries I've worked in, I can't eat, like in Pakistan, I've worked in Pakistan a little bit, and I can't even have a conversation with women in Pakistan, let alone talk to them about what they want. So we've had to have women in our team to do that conversation with the women about what they want and how to develop it and how to site it and et cetera, et cetera. And certainly cultures. And I talked about Fiji, we got a toilet for male, toilets for females, and for lots of reasons we would always I wouldn't say in refugee camps in Africa necessarily, but if we can divide males and females up into having their own facilities, we would always do that if it's practical. But more so lot of reasons just around security reasons to separate them off, and particularly at night when people are going to toilets, the women like to go to their toilet and the men, can go to their toilet. So yeah, it's an increase. Well, it's such an entrenched part of the cultures of many countries I work in. You just assume that that's going to be issues around gender are just automatic things you certainly take into account.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for your time today, and thanks for sharing your wealth of knowledge. And we really appreciate your time. I'd
You're very welcome.
I'd like to hand over to Tanya Morrison, the New Zealand Institute of Environmental Health National President, to introduce her speaker.
Well, thanks, Melissa, and happy World Toilet Day, everyone. Who would have thought we could make a webinar out of talking about toilets, but such is the varied role of environmental health practitioners, we can talk about anything all day long. It is with great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who is from our side of the ditch here in New Zealand, Dr. Louise Weaver. Louise is the technical lead for microbial solutions based in Christchurch, South Island of New Zealand. She holds a PhD in environmental microbiology, specialising in protozoan parasites in wastewater, and has extensive experience in the microbial water quality, water and wastewater treatment, including the contaminants in aquatic environments. Amongst her research and many other accolades, without stealing her thunder too much, she's developed many tools that go into the WASH system, which is the water sanitation and hygiene strategies, along with her team just using or trying to create the bridge, I guess, between science and practice to deliver the solutions where they are needed. Her presentation title today is Sanitation in a Changing World, going into the WASH approach in an attempt to reduce public health risks. Good afternoon from our side of the ditch. Welcome to you, Louise.
Thanks very much, Tanya, for the introduction. Kia ora, everyone from New Zealand. So I'm just going to give you a quick run through of the sort of work that we do. Just introduce, first of all, my institution, because we've recently had a change of name. So we're now the New Zealand Institute for Public Health and Forensic Science. We used to be ESR, or Environmental Science and Research Limited, which is one of the Crown Research institutes in New Zealand. We've now been changed into a primary research organisation, and with a new title. So our remit still basically looks at any risks that are around that impact public health, essentially. So it's quite broad. We have a lot of people who do a whole range of different things. And I'd like to acknowledge as well, there's a whole team that work around the sanitation, wastewater, drinking water side of things at PHF Science. So it's not just me. So I've stolen a lot of information from other people. So. A lot of the work that we do, we end up looking in that lovely image on the top left there in wastewater, and there's we've just heard about after you've been to the toilet and flushed the chain, we get to play about with what happens after that. So we spend a lot of time looking at systems, particularly decentralized systems in the Pacific environments. We do also work with communities in New Zealand as well, smaller communities that are on septic tank supplies and other small scale wastewater treatment systems. And we know that it's quite broad in terms of, as we've just heard about, the acceptance of particular usage of your wastewater as well, because we also look at a circular economy approach, so what you can and can't do with it, where it can end up and where it can't end up. So it can be quite variable of what sort of work that we do. I've just put on this really, really busy slide. This is from my colleague who I believe he talked a couple of years ago for World Toilet Day as well, Matt Ashworth, who heads up the Pacific team. Previously it was Jan Gregor, but once she retired, Matt took over her inevitable role, which is pretty broad. So we do a lot of different things in and around the Pacific, depending on the needs in that particular country. Like we've just heard about, it is really going to talk to the people and seeing how they want to get any advice or help, and it can be all the way from looking at particular options for wastewater treatment through to designing techniques where they can actually assess the quality of their water, through to actually doing some hazard mapping, etc. This just gives you one example of some of the work that we've done. So this is with Jan Greger a few years ago and Matt Ashworth, where they looked at creating a sanitation ladder. So they went and talked to the community to see what particular environmental conditions they had and what the community wanted, like we've heard about, whether they want a particular type of toilet facility, and what approaches they could do from it. So there was a lot of discussion and conversation around it. And then they produced a nice risk map where they could actually see if they had, it was like a decision framework, so different options, and then coming up with the most applicable option for that particular approach. We can see that most of the time, a compost toilet for this particular occasion was the best option, but then there's other issues around that and acceptability. So that's why I really asked that slightly loaded question around the acceptance of a particular approach for waste management can be challenging in itself. So the upshot of this work was to help this particular community in improving their water and sanitation, because as we can see, they've got their drinking water supply and their dwellings quite close by, and they didn't have a solution for their waste at that time, and so we were offering a solution for them that was applicable and would actually be taken up and used by the community. Leaping ahead to another different sort of piece of work that we've done, where we've looked at how do we actually define where septic tanks are located in a particular country. This is work that we did in Tonga. It was on I forgot what it's called now, Tongatapu, the largest island in Tonga, where we were trying to help them locate some of their septic tanks, because they were aware, they were trying to look at potentially sources for new drinking water supplies and the risks from those. And then from that, it borne out that we needed to understand where these septic tank locations were. So amazing modeler that we have, Rachel Q, brought together lots and lots of pieces of information, including looking at land parcels, building outlines, etc., and also population dynamics and information from the location to see whether we could improve on the estimated septic tank locations. And you can see here they estimated there is just under 11,000 septic tank systems on Tongatapu, for example, and you'll see later on how accurate that picture was. But I'm now going to, I've just lost my mouse, there it is, leap across the ditch again back to New Zealand. So we also had questions in New Zealand itself, where initially I was thinking quite alarmingly, there wasn't enough information about knowing where septic tank systems were in and around rural catchments in New Zealand. So this is some work that we did with Environment Canterbury and then with Otago Regional Council, for examples, where we could use that same approach of mapping and pulling together lots of different pieces of information to improve knowledge of where septic tank systems are in rural catchments, because prior to around 1990, you didn't have to have it as a permitted activity, and so you didn't necessarily know exactly where septic tank locations were. And what we were finding is, particularly in our rural catchments, we often have quite shallow drinking water supplies as well. So we wanted to gain a picture of trying to have a risk framework for drinking water supplies as well, but we needed to know where these locations were. So we did the same approach for this, and you can see there's an alarming amount of septic tank systems in Canterbury and in Otago in those regional areas. You can just about see Christchurch is down here, so there's a nice grey patch here where we don't have any, but then there's an awful lot in our rural locations outside of Christchurch. One of the other things that we found useful for this piece of work is that we can find and we can look at from the international literature, but we can also map that to that GIS map that we've got in terms of how many septic tank systems you've got. And there's some risk frameworks that have been generated internationally where they're trying to say what is a safe number of septic tank systems you can have in a particular location if you want to try and reduce that risk of those water and sanitation risks in a particular location. So we did some work on this and seeing what is the optimal density. And then Rachel did some amazing work again in trying to map those on the top. So you can see the darker the the colour of the square that we've got on these overlaid over where these septic tank locations are, the more septic tank systems you've got. And the little tick here is this, that, for example, is one that we know are consented on-site management systems. So that's a more recent septic tank location, whereas the others were previously unmapped. So you can see there's some quite dense areas where we have a lot of septic tank systems. And as I say, these areas often have very shallow groundwater that they're using for their drinking water supply as well. Another part of the work that we can do from this information as well is overlay on top what we already know about community drinking water protection zones. So that ties into what I was previously saying, where there is an estimated risk factor where you're not meant to have anything, any land use activities that could impact on your drinking water supply, for example. Whereas you can see here where we've mapped on these on-site systems, we do actually have quite a few. They are downstream, most of them, but there are still some that are upstream. So I didn't say that the groundwater is going from the right to the left. So that's why the drinking water protection zone is this particular shape, because it's flowing downstream. So you can see though that there are septic tank systems that are in close proximity to that drinking water supply. And you'll note here that the well depth is relatively shallow, so it's 24 metres. And in this particular location, the overlying geology is quite open framework gravel, so that means that there's a high chance of anything coming from the surface into that drinking water supply is quite high. I'll just sort of flicked through that. Yeah, so we also were able to do this, as I say, going back to Tonga to try and help them show how you could compile all this information together and get a bigger picture of your whole water and drinking water and wastewater systems. So you get a bigger picture and you can compile a lot more information and try and see what are the conjoined risks in a particular location. So this gave an example here in this particular village where we can see there's 32 estimated septic tank locations that are close to their drinking water, the village well in this location, which again was quite a shallow drinking water well. So we can see here that we weren't too far off the mark though with our estimation of the septic tank locations in Tongatapu. So it was just below 11,000 was the estimate, whereas it's just over 11,000. But with the mapping, what we found is useful is compiling those other pieces of information and overlaying it, so you can bring different parts of the piece together and provide a better risk framework from it. Also, what was useful from this piece of work, we've also then looked at that hazard mapping as well. So we can see there's an awful lot of systems that are quite close to the coast and in low-lying areas. So there's a higher risk of things like king tide events, heavy extreme weather events that will impact these systems. And obviously, if you have a septic tank system and it overflows or fails in these particular situations, you've got high risk of contamination. Another piece of work that we do is trying to increase our knowledge in terms of the data that goes into things like these models that we create. So we wanted to see whether we could improve our knowledge of what actually happens through an on-site wastewater management system, aka a septic tank system, after the toilet flush. So we can take samples after the toilet flush in the treatment plant, the land application plant system, and then down into that vadose zone. So that's that unsaturated zone before you hit the groundwater below. So we can try and build a better map of the risk profile from each of those different stages. So to do this, we've recently developed a field site where we've actually talked with the local owner who's agreed to allow us to put in sampling locations on their new on-site system that they've put in place. We're able to also talk to the manufacturer of that system to put in place that we did it in a staged approach, so we could have a look at a basic septic tank system and then add on different treatment technologies that would improve that treatment efficiency. And the image on the right just shows you an example of this is the vadose zone. This is the normal alluvial gravel that we often have in and around Canterbury region. So you can see it's pretty open, and so there's really high chance for contaminants to move through that system. So this just gives you a bit of a snapshot of the system and what we set up there. So we've got the toilet is in the dwelling actually, and then we've just got the effluent delivery line here. This is the new land application site. We initially had one here, which is our basic system. This is the improved land application site, and each of those blue dots are where we can take samples from, and that arrow just shows you where the groundwater flow direction is. We've got a drinking water well as well, which is upstream of this system for these dwellings here. So again, there's shallow groundwater in quite close proximity to that on-site system. This just gives you a bit more information on the system. And nice little images of how we put it in place. So we wanted to actually sample within that vadosone zone. So we designed a system where we could actually take samples within there, because we were surprised to see there wasn't anything that we could buy off the shelf to do this. So we had to design a system that enabled us to do so. So now this gives you a bit more of a diagram of the system, or a mock-up of it, where we can place an auto sampler and take timed samples at a particular location at each of those well points and all the way through the system, so we can map out what is the removal capacity at each different stage for different contaminants that are in that system. We've done two tracer studies so far. One of them was on the new system, just to see how it responds immediately, and then one which is at a later date, where we had a more conditioned system. So we put in a virus surrogate, so that's one on the left, the MS2 bacteriophage. Potassium bromide is used as a conservative tracer, so it just travels through the system. So it gives you an indication that you haven't missed anything because it hasn't gone that way. You know, you have confidence that you followed that flow path. And then E. coli is a bacterial indicator through the system. Just in order of time, so we don't get into the detail of it, because I am a microbiologist, so I will get into the detail if I'm not careful. But basically what we do is a breakthrough curve. So we can see here the red line, you'll note at the bottom is flat line all the way through, because basically through our system, this is a well, sorry, that's around 2 meters away from that land application site, so it's gone through the system. So it just gives you an example of what we see breaking through, but E. coli didn't. We think that what's happening with the E. coli is there's a lot of size exclusion. So the system that we have in place, even though there's alluvial gravels, there were sand pockets within there. So once it hits that, then the E. coli is held up quite readily. There's also biofilm that develops, but even in this initial one, where we didn't really have any biofilm build-up, we still didn't see E. coli coming through the system. So it was held up pretty well in that system. What was important to note, though, is that our bacteriophage, which is our viral surrogate, did move through this system, and there were 2 peaks of it moving through. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then this black line is the bromide, so we can see that the bromide path came through. People normally ask, why did the phage come through before the bromide? And this is size exclusion again, and it's all around the flow paths that are taken. So this initial breakthrough of the phage is through the major flow path, so the fast and quick open framework as it moves through. But then there's also a second peak which lines a bit more with the bromide, where it goes through much smaller fissures and channels, which takes longer to pass through. So when we repeated this after the conditioning phase, we could see that we do get a similar picture, but it's a little bit different. We don't see quite as much phage coming through. We still see this 2 peak system coming through. We don't even see as much bromide coming through the system. We, again, don't see much E. coli coming through at all because of that size exclusion, essentially. And we had even more size exclusion impacts, and it even impacted on the viruses because we had a lot more biofilm buildup. we did an excavation into that land application site and took samples through it, and we could see that the viruses were being held up within that biofilm that had formed around that land application site. So they were being held up. What we're now looking into in more detail is, are they still viable? So is that those still a risk factor, that even if they are being held up and removed from and not immediately getting into our groundwater supply, is there still a risk because they're being held up? And then again, if we have a heavy rainfall event or huge groundwater fluctuations, which we do get, could that actually flush through a big plug of virus? So a lot of the work that I've just talked about there, we end up putting into things like this microbial risk assessment tool. So this is a piece of work that was undertaken by ourselves and GNS, who are now, I've forgotten what they're called now, they're now Earth Sciences Research Institute, where we were trying to improve that microbial risk assessment in recognizing multiple different microbes. You can see here that you can plug in to this tool that's open source, so we can provide you with the links, you can play about with it, but it also looked at improving those particular inputs into those systems. So it's not just looking at one septic tank system, it's looking at multiple septic tank systems at a distance. Say here for this example, there's numerous systems that you're looking up and downstream of your well. So this is your drinking water well that you might want to look at your risk assessment for that. So, and it is an ongoing piece of work, because the more information that we put into those things, the more improved our results get. So we're continually trying to improve the tools that we undertake. And all of these tools then, just to bring it back really to the work that we do around the wash, is applied to those wash situations as well. So we go back to the communities as well and talk about those particular risk factors, and then talk to them as well about what are the solutions that they would like to see in place. So I just want to thank as well. So there's a huge, it's even bigger than that actually, but the main people who work in that space, particularly Matt Ashworth and his team, now following on from Jan Gregor and Bron Humphreys, who did a lot of the work that I just showed, looking at the on-site system. So Bron is over in Australia at the moment presenting on that work as well. So kia ora. Yeah, I think I shall leave it at that. And
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Louise.
Thank you.
That's, yeah, really insightful. I've definitely got a couple of questions anyway, but we've got a couple in the chat. Any comment on the devastating earthquakes, as we all know, in the Canterbury area, 2011? Were there a lot of septic tank failures after the earthquakes? Did drinking water become contaminated, presumably from septic tanks more specifically, and how that was managed? Any comments around that?
It's a really interesting question, and one that we did have at the time. We didn't find too much evidence of that. I don't know whether it's, in part for me, it might well have been because the whole system was disrupted, and so people weren't necessarily drinking their water as they would normally. So there was a lot of bottled water supplies that was brought into the area. Us for ourselves, we ended up losing, we couldn't use our septic tank systems, so we ended up bringing in our own bespoke system, shall we say. But then the council came in after that and supplied us with chemical toilets. So it was that, I think that was more the factor around why there weren't as many outbreaks or incidents around that. It was just basically the whole system had failed completely, and so you'd stop that link between the waste and your drinking water supply. Maybe we were fortunate as well. But yeah, it's really interesting. I do still often wonder about that, whether there was some hidden hidden incidents and outbreaks that people don't really, didn't talk about. So
yeah, absolutely. A question around, during your studies, did you notice the wrong type of effluent disposal systems being installed in unsuitable soil types?
Yes, so we do often see that, and some, I mean, even in our own work that we did there in that field site that we set up, we initially had the disposal system you saw was quite a basic disposal system, but then we had I can't remember which hurricane it was, we had a huge hurricane come through and the groundwater table fluctuated massively that it had never done before. So we were within 500 mil of the surface. So that's why we ended up then installing this improved mounded system. But yeah, often the work, in particular that Matt and Bron have done over in the Pacific, where we see systems where they might have a septic tank system, but then they've just got a pipe that just then goes straight onto the beach, or they've applied the same logic of putting in a system. That's why I was asking about those flush toilets, but then they don't have the end product. Or we've had others where they've put their land application system and then it's right next to their drinking water well. So yeah, often we do see that, but we do see that here as well. Yeah.
Question here, in my region, neighbours blame other neighbours for the encroachment of wastewater onto other properties following the alleged failure or lack of servicing of treatment plants or LAS. Sometimes this isn't very clear. What's the best thing to sample for to confirm the water is from a TP? Does that make sense to you?
Tank.
Treatment plant, I'm guessing.
Treatment plant, yes, that's it. Yeah, so we are developing tools that we're trying to improve that, because it is sometimes quite tricky, especially if you've got potential mixed sources in a location that you do have in a rural system. We're finding that using some of the contaminants of emerging concern, you can use some of those to signature whether it is from a septic tank system. Also using things like caffeine or sucralose, that is most likely going to come from a human input. So we do use those sorts of tools to try and track it back to saying what is the actual risk factor. But often in those rural locations, from the work that we've done, it can be mixed. So that's what we're trying to work on at the moment, is trying to, how do we get what is the most input into that system? So it might be mixed, but which is the main one in there? So using some of those combinations of fecal source tracking markers with some of those caffeine, sucralose, and other contaminants of emerging concern as well, trying to improve that, yeah, because it is a problem. Yeah.
If I take you back during your presentation, you were highlighting an area of Yaldhurst, which is in the Canterbury region for our Aussie friends. You had a picture up on your screen around the septic tanks that were mostly downstream, not all, but were within that community drinking water protection zone. So knowing that information, what kind of conversations would then be had, given that you've now plotted them within that protection zone?
Yeah, so this is where, I mean, we're working with the council. So that's when initially we were working more with the regional council, but then we go to the unitary authority as well, to try and talk to, like, say, Selwyn, to talk to them about what are the risk factors. And then it's good to go then and ground truth it, to go and talk to people as well, and to find out more about the actual condition of the well as well, because it could be that, yes, it is quite shallow, but it might be well managed. So we've done a lot of work with the councils looking at improving their wellhead protection, for example. So you're trying to improve it, and so they'll have a casing around it to try and reduce that risk. So even though the well is maybe quite shallow there, I'm just looking at, again, 24 meters, there will be an aquitard as well at a particular location. So you'd hope that they have then blocked anything that could come in from above that. So yeah.
And a final question, just around the frequency of testing, in terms of testing the soil, for example, to assess or build that into your risk framework. Can you speak a little around frequency of testing?
Oh, that's a difficult one as well, because that's one that we're in conversation with, actually, with the GNS guys, on how often should we be doing this, because it's something, again, that I think that we need to get a bit better at doing, because often with a lot of the models, we've gone and tested it once or twice or 3 times, and that's it, and that goes in the model. Whereas I think personally that we do need to get a better handle of that seasonality. Does it change? What are the fluxes? What are the main key drivers of those changes that occur? And I'm not sure that we're quite got a handle of that at the moment. So that hasn't really answered your question, but I think it's a work in progress, that. So it's great that it's been asked about.
Yeah, cool. And you got a nice shout out too for the tip on testing caffeine, essentially to assist those lovely complaints we get. It's the contamination of the council drains, and it's hard to tell if it's from human contamination or agriculture. So you got a nice shout out for that tip as well. So well done.
Thank you.
Look, thank you again so much, Louise, for joining us this afternoon for World Toilet Day and fascinating insights into the work that you and your team are doing. So well done and keep up the good work. It's very, very fascinating and interesting, that area that you're into.
Thanks very much for the invite.
No worries. I'm just going to hand back to Melissa just to close us out today. But once again, thank you to both of our speakers for helping us to celebrate this significant day.
Thanks so much, Tanya. In closing, as we conclude today's observance of World Toilet Day, I'd encourage everyone to take a moment to reflect on the powerful message behind this important occasion and remember that safe and clean sanitation is not a basic service, it is a fundamental human right. And there's still too many people in the world that lack access to safely managed sanitation. And as environmental health professionals, we do play an essential advocacy role. And as we move forward, let's continue the conversation and engage with questions and support the advocacy of environmental health professionals and all of those people working to improve sanitation for everyone. We are very grateful for our two speakers today for sharing their knowledge and experiences in implementing their effective sanitation projects. And I'd also like to thank Tanya for co-hosting the webinar, and we look forward to returning next year and sharing details of our 2026 EHANZ webinar series to our members soon. And a recording of this webinar will be made available through EHA and NZIEH in the coming weeks. And for the EHA members, just a reminder to add this webinar to your CPD points. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. Have a lovely day. Happy World Toilet Day, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.